At the end of last year, I sat down and filmed a reading wrap up of 2023, and I said that for 2024, I would sit down and film quarterly reading videos, and I haven't, and we're officially halfway through the year. So my bad. However, I thought better late than never. So I'm here to give you a big mid-year reading update. Where do I even begin? Do I do it in order? First book I read this year was Red Queen. This was our first book club book of the year. Powerless by Lauren Roberts was everyone in my book clubs, one of their top reads of last year. And I could be wrong, but I think it was inspired by this series and a few other fantasy books. So I thought that it'd be fun to read the OG. To be honest, I have not thought about this book since I read it, so that kind of tells you everything you need to know. I think I enjoyed my reading process, but I didn't really care about many of the characters. And unfortunately, I think I just liked Powerless better. And I was comparing the two, which is a fault of my own. I gave this a 3.5 star. I remember when I finished this, I was like, oh, I enjoyed it enough that I think I might continue on the rest of the series. And I haven't yet. And that was 6 months ago. And I haven't thought about it since. So that kind of gives you my overall feelings of this one. Like, it wasn't bad. It just wasn't that good. On my Kindle, I also read The Christmas Swap. So technically that's through December into January. So obviously a Christmas read, but if you are queer or even if you're not, put that on your TBR for Christmas time this year. In 6 months time, you promise me you need to read it because it was one of the best Christmas reads I've read. It was girl and guy who are friends, fake dating, but then the girl falls in love with his sister. It was so good. The audiobook is also on Spotify. Really highly rate that. It's set in England, so phenomenal accents. I gave it 5 stars. It ticked all my boxes. I really, really rate The Christmas Swap. Then I picked up my first cozy fantasy. Rach gave me this for Christmas. We did a little bestie Christmas book swap, and I feel so many things for this book. On one hand, while I was reading it, I was really, really bored. I think because it wasn't really plot heavy, like there just wasn't a lot happening. But while I was bored, I didn't really want to put it down. I was bored, but I was having a good time being bored. It's also queer, and there's 2 older men who fall in love. No, like why would you bring old men into this? I'm getting teary-eyed just thinking about it. The story of this book is so pure and so wholesome. I just don't know how you could read a book like this and still hate gay people. The found family in this book made me cry on multiple occasions. The storyline, the characters, the love story, all of it was so adorable, pulled at my heartstrings just the right amount. And while I was really bored reading it, I haven't stopped thinking about the family in this book ever since. I think about it at least once a week. The found family in this took my heart and ran away with it and hasn't given it back since. I think about this book all the time. I would love to read more from this author. So good. Sticking with the fantasy theme, I then picked up the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy. I actually need to go out and buy the 3rd book now that it's been released in the same size, so I'll have my complete set. Sometimes I get fooled into thinking I like a book more than I do just because it's quick and easy to read. I read this whole trilogy, I think in a week. I was on a tropical holiday reading by the pool and the beach all week, and I flew through them. But I don't think that's necessarily because I was obsessed with them. I think they're good, but I also just think I've read better. I just don't think I really liked the love story, the love interests. I wasn't reading them like pining for them to get together, and I feel like that's kind of important in a lot of books. Like, not bad, but just not my favorite. I gave the first one 3 stars and the second and third both 4 stars. So do with that what you will. Oh my god. Then, oh, I've just knocked you, sorry. Yeah. I read the first Magnolia Parks book last year, and I don't know why it took me so long to pick up the rest of the series because I enjoyed the first book, but I just wasn't like craving or itching to pick up the next one. But then once I started Daisy Hates, you couldn't stop me, actually. And I feel like there was a point where I questioned even continuing the rest of this series, and I'm just so glad that I did. Daisy Hates' characters and storyline brought me straight back into the world, really got me hooked. I'm definitely more of a Daisy than a Magnolia girl, but I very quickly through the rest of the series, and I gave all of these 5 stars. I think the first Magnolia book I gave 4, but these? So if you're like me and have read the first one, not sure if you should continue, I would say just read the first Daisy and just see if you like it any better. If not, don't continue, but if you do, these are all waiting for you, which is so gorgeous. Like, I'm jealous actually that you get to read them for the first time. I also read None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. This was one of our book club books. I listened to all of it on Spotify, which I really don't listen to audiobooks all that often, but I heard really, really good things about the audiobook, and I'm glad I listened to it because it was about a podcast, so the audio changed when they were just reading the book and then when they were recording the podcast, and I really loved that aspect of it. I gave this one 3 stars. It just wasn't one of my favorite thrillers. I hated the ending. Hated. And one of the main characters was so incredibly insufferable that it affected my reading experience. And I understand that sometimes characters are just meant to be annoying. Like, that's half the point. But it gets to a point sometimes where I'm so infuriated that I can't enjoy myself. So it got 3 stars from me. Then I felt like it'd been a while since I read A Silly Little Romance, and I had the rest of the Eden series to read. The Eden series is just a small town romance, and each book is about a different sibling in the Eden family. I still stand by the fact that the first one was the best, and I go into reading these with really, really low expectations because they're kind of just a palate cleanser for me. I can understand why people love them, but I think I'm just not a romance girl to my heart and soul, and so these just kind of get me by. They're an easy page turner, easy to fly through, not a lot of thinking. Very spicy. Every time I read one, I'm kind of just shocked because I feel so family friendly. All the siblings are so close, and then like bam, spice. But they do their job, you know. I think I rated these really low. Jasper Vale got 3 stars and Crimson River got 2. So we had another book club book that I read on my Kindle, which was Finley Donovan is Killing It. And if I remember correctly, we all didn't like this book. I didn't know it was a popular book going into it, and then Rach was like, everyone loves this book, and we were all gobsmacked because it just wasn't my favorite. I think that it might be classified as a cozy thriller, which I just don't think sat well with me. I don't think that you can be killing people and making it cozy, for me personally. I gave it 2.5 stars. That feels really rude, but it's just my opinion. And then it was my turn to choose book club book, and I chose The Invocations. I went into this really, really blind. Like, I made all my friends reading it without knowing anything about it, but I actually bought this as a blind date with a book. What is this genre? I always forget. Magical dark academia horror, potentially. Like, that just sounds like a bunch of random words to me. All I knew going into this was that it was YA, queer, thriller, horror energy, and I was really, really intrigued, and I really liked it. I've only ever read thriller. I've never read horror before, and I would love to read a bit more horror moving forward. I think it might just have to be YA because this was pretty gruesome for me, but this really, really surprised me, and I really loved it. There was 3 main characters, and there was one supernatural killer on the loose, and they all brought a different thing to the group to work together to bring down the bad guy, and I just loved it. I loved the characters, I loved the storyline, loved the ending. I gave this 4.5 stars. I really loved it. This was a bit of a different book for me, but I read Everyone in This Room Will Someday Be Dead. I bought this when I was in New York, and it took me 6 months to get around to reading it, which is crazy because look how small it is. Oh, I forgot I folded down pages to highlight. If you're queer, or you have religious trauma, or you have anxiety, or you're a triple threat like me and have all 3, you need to read this book. It's only 243 pages, very doable. This review on Goodreads says the exact opposite of escapism. Reading this book was like living in my head intensified, and I couldn't agree more. On one side, it's kind of hard because it brings you a little bit down into the dumps, being really anxious, what's the point of living, a lot of mental health issues. But then on the other side, it made me feel so validated in every thought I've had ever. Main character is gay, she accidentally gets a job at a Catholic church. It's funny, it's sad, it's so incredibly relatable, and I kind of feel like everyone needs to read it, to be honest. 5 stars from me. Then I picked up another romance. This is Love Match by Claire Fletcher. Ugh, I wish I liked this. I really wish I did. From the little information I knew about it, I thought I was gonna love it. It's Australian, it's queer, the main girl plays rugby. I'm into it. It's on the right track, but I just didn't love it. First of all, set in Queensland, and like, I don't know why I didn't like knowing where they were talking about. She lived in a rural town outside of Brisbane and would travel into Brisbane, and Brisbane was like the big smoke. I just feel like of all cities in Australia, Brisbane, oh, not the big smoke. You know, I kind of found the main character really insufferable, and I didn't want to. Like, I really wanted to love it. I feel like it was such a long book, but it missed so much of her coming to terms with her sexuality. I wish we got a little bit more insight into her realizing that she was gay. I feel like you knew that it was coming, and then it just happened, and I don't know. I feel like we got so much information about everything else in this book apart from the important part. It is kind of hard though because I want to advocate for queer books, but this one just didn't. I gave it 2 stars. I feel like such a bitch whenever I say I don't like a book. Like, how dare I have an opinion? I hate it. But because I loved The Invocation so much, I decided to pick up another book by the same author. This is House of Hollow. I loved it. I loved this so much, and I thought I loved The Invocations, loved this even more. So good. 5 out of 5, 10 out of 10. I think this and The Invocations are such a good way to get into horror if you're unsure whether you'd be into it or not. YA, again, I don't know if I could read adult horror because this is so gruesome for me. This follows 3 sisters who all went missing and then came back and were never really quite the same ever again, and then one of the sisters goes missing, and it's just a story about finding her and learning about what happened when they went missing, and and I loved it so much. Again, I loved all of the characters. This had me hooked. I think I read it in 2 days. It's under 300 pages. I just honestly couldn't recommend this more. Then I read Powerful by Lauren Roberts. This is the little novella following Powerless before we get the next book. If you read Powerless, this follows Adina, so the best friend, over the same time frame as the first book. Obviously it's a novella, so it's not a huge fleshed out story, but I love Adina. I loved this little story from her. It felt so nice being back in the world, learning about what was going on with her while Peyton was off doing her thing. It was crazy how quickly this just took me back to the world and how much I loved being there. So cutie, and made me even more excited for the next book in the series. I can't wait, don't speak to me. I also read another YA fantasy. This is Cinderella is Dead. I had a really tricky time deciding how I felt about this book because the premise and the messaging behind it I think is really important. It's queer. It's like a Cinderella adaptation. I wouldn't say it's a retelling. The main character is a queer woman of color in a world where women are just seen as dirt and they're only good to be married off to the best man and men just rule the world. Classic. And so Cinderella and the love interest take down the patriarchy basically. So I feel like that premise is really important, and I think as a young girl I would have adored this book for that, but I feel like as an adult it was just a little bit boring, a little bit predictable, but I think because all of the other messaging was so important it made me like it a little bit more. So I gave it 3.5 stars. Could be 4 stars if I'm like feeling generous. I think if you're under the age of 18 would recommend, like so important, and like a cute little story. I think I might have just been a little bit too old to enjoy it to its full potential. Then it was time for me to read another romance. Every now and then I just need a little palate cleanser, and I picked up She Gets the Girl. I had read the first 10% of this and then put it down because I was bored. I wasn't getting into the story. I just don't feel like I was really in the mood for a romance at the time. But then when I re-picked it up, could not get enough of it. So I don't know if it deserves a 5 stars because of that first 10%, but I did give it 5 stars because I loved it so much. I've seen these 2 authors on TikTok. They're married and they write stories together, and I'm just obsessed with that. This is YA. Both of the main characters are in college. Very polar opposite personalities. One of the girls is teaching the other girl how to date and be confident and put herself out there, and then I'll leave the rest up to the imagination. But I just loved the dynamic. I loved both of the characters. I feel like I saw a lot of myself in Molly, and I always feel like when you can see yourself in one of the characters it makes you love it so much more. This is definitely one of my favorite queer romances. I really recommend. We're getting up to really recent books, but we read The Heartless Hunter. It's called that on Goodreads, but it's also called The Crimson Moth. I don't know why it has 2 names, but we read The Crimson Moth for book club. I think that I did myself a disservice with this book because I left it to the very last minute and I was rushing getting it done in time, and I think that that made me like it a little bit less than I potentially could have, but it just wasn't my favorite. It was another YA fantasy, kind of like Bridgerton world vibes, but witches. I did really enjoy learning about the witches and that whole aspect of the book, but I think the love interest, there was a bit of a brother love triangle, a bit of a Elena, Damon and Stefan moment, if you will, but I just didn't care about either of the brothers. I didn't think she should have ended up with either of them, and I think it's hard to like a fantasy book when you don't really care about the love interests. Kind of the same as what I said about the Once Upon a Broken Heart trilogy. So I gave it 3.5 stars, but again, maybe I could have liked it more if I didn't read it in literally 2 days. We'll never know. And then to finish off this video, I've most recently been making my way through the Throne of Glass series. I'm so happy that I finally bit the bullet and started this. I read ACOTAR last year, and that was my first experience with fantasy, and I loved it. And ever since I finished that, I told myself that I would start Throne of Glass. It took me a very long time to finally do it. I think 8 books is just a huge commitment, and I was just scared. I'm currently reading Air of Fire, so I'm on the 4th book, almost halfway. I thought it would be really fun to film a whole separate reading vlog for this series, just so I can give every single thought I have ever to that vlog. Obviously that'll be probably a long time away until you see that because I have 4 huge books to get through. But so far I'm really loving Selena. I'm obsessed with her. And so now you're officially up to date with all of the books that I have read this year. Only 25 more to go to hit my reading goal. Will I do it? Only time will tell. But if you sat through this whole video, literally love you so much. I really appreciate it. You just listened to me ramble for way too long. But I love you so much, and I'll see you in my next video very soon.